The Imperial Japanese Navy told a young man from Hiroshima Prefecture, or Nagasaki, or the rice paddies of Fukuoka, that he had been chosen for something extraordinary. Not just the Navy, the battleship fleet, the steel backbone of the Empire's sea power. The men assigned to Yamato or Musashi were informed, formally, through the chain of command, in language that left no room for misinterpretation, that they were serving aboard the most powerful warships ever constructed by human hands. That part was true. The Navy's institutional messaging around battleship service in the early years of the Pacific War was built on a foundation of genuine engineering achievement. Yamato displaced nearly 72,000 tons at full combat load. She stretched 862 feet from bow to stern. Her 9 main guns, each barrel measuring 18.1 inches across, could throw a shell weighing more than a Volkswagen automobile, a distance of over 25 miles. Each of her 3 main turrets weighed more than most destroyers in the fleet. When a first-time crew member reported aboard and walked the length of the ship's main deck, he required a map. Officers who served on Yamato described needing directional arrows painted on the interior bulkheads, simply to navigate from one compartment to another without becoming lost. The Navy said this scale meant something. It said these ships were unsinkable, that the armor belting their sides, up to 16 inches of hardened Vickers cemented steel at the waterline, made them immune to anything the enemy could bring to bear. It said the men assigned to these vessels occupied the most prestigious posts in the combined fleet. It said their names would be remembered. What it did not say was that those same ships would spend the majority of the war sitting at anchor, burning through the Empire's dwindling fuel reserves, while the men aboard them drilled, waited, and slowly came to understand that the institution housing them had made fundamental miscalculations about the nature of the war they were fighting. Understanding what daily existence meant for the 2,500 men who crewed a Yamato-class battleship requires beginning not with their actions, but with the physical environment that contained them. Because the machine told the story. A battleship of that era was, from the perspective of the men living inside it, a steel city with no sky and very little oxygen. The internal compartmentalization required by the ship's damage control design divided the hull into hundreds of separate watertight spaces. Moving between them required passing through hatches set into bulkheads at knee height, a motion that required bending, stepping over, and straightening, repeated dozens of times daily until it became automatic. In rough seas, those same hatches became bruising obstacles that collected their toll in shin injuries and shoulder scrapes across the entire complement. The forward enlisted berthing spaces, where the majority of Yamato's 2,500-man crew ate and slept, were arranged in the lower decks, well below the waterline. Ventilation in these spaces was provided by ducted air systems that circulated the same recycled atmosphere through the same steel passageways, picking up the accumulated traces of engine exhaust, cooking smells, fuel oil, and the biology of 2,500 men living at close quarters. The men who served aboard and survived the war described the smell of those lower decks as something that embedded itself in clothing, skin, and memory with equal permanence. After a week aboard, they could no longer detect it. Visitors noticed it immediately. The hammocks, the Navy still called them hammocks even when they were fixed pipe frames, were arranged in tiers in the berthing compartments, with the overhead so close that a man in the top tier could flatten his palm against the deck above him without extending his arm fully. Storage for personal belongings was minimal by design. The Navy's philosophy gave no institutional weight to the comfort of enlisted men beyond what their functional performance required. You slept, you ate, you returned to your station. There was a name the men of the fleet gave to Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, and it was not a compliment. Other Japanese sailors, the crews of cruisers, destroyers, and transports who were being sent to the front lines of the Solomon Islands campaign, who were running the Guadalcanal supply runs, who were watching their ships get hit, called the two great battleships by a name that circulated through the fleet, with the particular velocity of truths that institutions prefer to suppress. They called them Hotel Yamato and Hotel Musashi. The name documented a specific resentment. While Yamato sat at anchor at Truk Lagoon, or the inland sea base at Hashirajima, the rest of the fleet was being consumed in the waters around Guadalcanal. Destroyers were going down in the slot. Cruisers were taking torpedo hits in night engagements. Carrier air groups were being shredded over the Central Pacific. And the two most powerful warships ever built by any navy were functioning as floating headquarters, conserving their fuel, protecting their hulls, and generating enormous institutional friction among the men who were dying while they waited. One officer from a freighter assigned to forward supply runs captured the sentiment and testimony recorded after the war. He said the men at the front lines were always being sent to the most forward positions, while the men on Yamato and Musashi sat behind. The language he used was not diplomatic. It was the language of men who had been in the water. The battleship crews were not unaware of this. The men aboard Yamato knew what was being said about them. They knew the name, and they knew that the resentment was not entirely unjust, that there was something genuinely corrosive about occupying the fleet's most celebrated ships while the fleet bled in waters they were not being sent to. One veteran who served aboard Yamato in 1942 described the experience of watching news arrive at the ship about losses in the Solomons campaign. He said the information arrived with a specific weight that the ship's size and firepower did nothing to lighten. The Imperial Japanese Navy's institutional culture arrived aboard every ship in the fleet, in the form of a hierarchy whose enforcement mechanisms had been refined over decades into something that expressed itself most directly in the space between senior and junior, and most visibly in what happened when that space was violated. Officers were drawn primarily from the Naval Academy at Edajima, an institution modeled in part on Annapolis, but inflected with a particular interpretation of Bushido, the warrior code, that emphasized collective duty, emotional suppression, and a structured indifference to individual suffering that was considered not cruel, but simply correct. The officers who came out of Edajima did not think of enlisted sailors as people requiring consideration in the modern sense. They thought of them as the material through which naval effectiveness was expressed. The men were trained. The men were drilled. The men performed. One veteran who served aboard Yamato described the evening discipline sessions, periods in which petty officers and senior NCOs conducted what was officially described as moral instruction. He said the commanding officer would instill naval spirit into the men, using a rod of oak. He said his principal satisfactions during his 2 years aboard consisted of eating, sleeping, and arriving in port. This was not described as complaint. It was described as the baseline condition of service. The watch rotations required men to be ready to sprint to their assigned stations at any moment, regardless of whether they were eating or sleeping or in the middle of any other activity. A general quarters alarm did not wait for meals to conclude. The men internalized this as a physiological condition, the specific alertness that developed from extended periods of knowing that any sound from the alarm system might require them to be at their guns within 60 seconds. The institutional culture had no mechanism for acknowledging that sustained high-alert states impose cognitive and physical costs on the men experiencing them. There was no language in the fleet's official documents for what would later be described as combat fatigue. A man was fit for duty or he was not. The intermediate condition, the state of being functional but operating below full capacity, was not a recognized category. The provisioning of a Yamato-class battleship at full complement presented a logistical challenge that the Navy's supply system addressed through a formal ration structure built around rice as its caloric foundation. The planned daily ration for an enlisted sailor included rice, dried fish, pickled vegetables, miso, and fresh provisions for the early days of a deployment when refrigeration permitted. The caloric total in the planned ration was theoretically sufficient for men doing physical work. The gap between the planned ration and the actual ration widened as the war progressed, and the logistics network that supplied the fleet came under increasing strain from American submarine operations. By 1943, the Japanese tanker fleet was being sunk at rates the naval staff had not projected when the war's supply requirements were calculated. This arrived at the fleet level not as a strategic announcement, but as a practical reality experienced in the mess decks. Rice that tasted of its storage container, canned provisions that carried the flavor of their own tin, the progressive disappearance of fresh components from the daily meal. What the provisioning did not address was the particular variety of hell that was the daily reality of men aboard Yamato for most of 1942 and 1943. The boredom. A ship sitting at anchor is not a ship at war. It is a steel structure in which 2,500 men perform maintenance, conduct drills, stand watches, eat their diminishing rations, and find ways to distribute the hours between them. Gambling was prohibited, and occurred. Personal correspondence was censored, and written anyway. Sleep was the most effective use of time, and was taken in quantities that the Navy's official schedule did not formally accommodate, but that the crew developed informal strategies for acquiring. Kazushi, a veteran who joined Yamato's first crew in 1941, described the ship's early operational period in an interview recorded decades after the war. He said that while it was glorious on paper, the reality involved a great deal of time anchored in port or hidden among Japan's many islands, partially to conserve fuel. Fuel was a resource the Empire's strategic situation made precious almost immediately, and a ship that could not move because there was no fuel to move it was, regardless of its firepower, not fighting a war. The moment when Yamato and Musashi were finally committed to the war that had been consuming the rest of the fleet arrived in October 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in recorded history by the number of ships involved. The Imperial Navy organized its remaining strength into a series of forces intended to destroy the American invasion fleet, supporting the landings in the Philippines. Yamato and Musashi were the centerpiece of the center force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the ships around which the entire operation was designed. What happened to Musashi on October 24, 1944, in the Sibuyan Sea, documented in the most direct possible terms what the war had become. American carrier aircraft found the center force in the open ocean in daylight. Without adequate fighter protection, the Japanese carrier air groups had been consumed in the earlier Battle of the Philippine Sea. The surface fleet was exposed to repeated waves of attack. Musashi absorbed the punishment meant to stop the entire force. American pilots who participated in the attack described the experience of approaching Musashi. One TBF Avenger pilot, Jack Lawton, described the ship's response. Musashi was firing her massive 18-inch main guns into the water ahead of the attacking aircraft, creating enormous geysers intended to knock down torpedo bombers. He recalled feeling the muzzle blasts hit his aircraft from the exploding columns of water, certain at moments that his wings would fold under the shockwave. It was a gun so large, it was being used as an anti-aircraft weapon by proxy, attempting to create physical barriers in the air rather than aiming at individual aircraft. It was not enough. Musashi took approximately 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb hits before she rolled over and sank. The engagement lasted several hours. Her crew complement was approximately 2,400 men. The rescue operations that followed the sinking were constrained by the tactical situation in the same way all Pacific naval rescues were constrained. The surviving ships had a mission to continue, and stopping to search the water was not part of that mission. More than half of Musashi's crew did not survive. By the spring of 1945, the calculation that the Imperial Navy was making about its remaining major surface units had changed in a way that was never formally stated to the men who crewed them, but that expressed itself unmistakably in the operational orders they received. Operation Tengo was organized in response to the American invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. Yamato, the surviving sister, would be sent to Okinawa with 9 escorts, the cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. The official plan called for the ships to take aboard only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. Local base commanders ultimately authorized additional fuel amounting to 60% of capacity, but the operational conception remained what it was. The fleet's last battleship was being sent on a mission from which it was not expected to return. Yamato would sail to Okinawa, beach herself on the island's shore, and use her remaining ammunition as an unsinkable shore battery until she was destroyed. The men who received these orders understood their meaning. The fuel allocation told the story that the mission briefing did not need to state explicitly. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Carrier aircraft found Yamato in the East China Sea on April 7th. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours. Yamato absorbed more than a dozen torpedo hits and multiple bomb strikes before her forward magazine detonated in an explosion so large that the column of smoke was visible from the coast of Kyushu, over 100 miles away. Of her complement of approximately 2,700 men, fewer than 300 survived. The destroyers that had escorted Yamato pulled survivors from the water, under conditions that the tactical situation made impossible to conduct thoroughly. The men in the water had life jackets and debris and each other. Most of them were not found. The water off Kyushu in April was cold enough that survival time without extraction was measured in hours. The survivors of Yamato who reached Japanese ports were assessed, documented, and in many cases reassigned to whatever remained of the fleet's operational capacity. The institutional structure that had sent them on a one-way voyage processed the return with the same formal efficiency it applied to every administrative function. A man was fit for duty, or he was not. Kazushi, who had transferred off Yamato in 1943 before the final operation, led the Battleship Yamato Society in the years after the war. A group of former crew members, most of whom had also served before the final mission. He said, the members did not really discuss what they had been through with each other. He said, his days aboard Yamato had formed the foundation of his life. He said, the best war was no war. He described taking a bath every afternoon in peacetime Japan, looking out his window at the domestic scene around him, and feeling a specific gratitude for the quality of what he was seeing, the unremarkable, the quiet, the ordinary. He said he was deeply thankful for lasting peace. The men who had stood at their stations aboard the most powerful battleships ever constructed, who had drilled for engagements that never came, who had waited through 2 years of anchor watches while the fleet bled around them, and who had then been sent into combat when the situation was already beyond recovery. Those men came home to ordinary lives and, for the most part, did not speak about what they had seen. The weight of that specific knowledge, of what a 2,700-man complement looked like when the ship carrying it went down, of what it meant to be assessed as fit for duty and assigned to another vessel after surviving the thing you were being sent back to. That knowledge did not leave with the uniform. It traveled home to fishing villages and rice paddies and the cities that the war had left standing. And it lived there, in the men who carried it, in the particular silence that surrounded every conversation about the Navy and the ships and the water. The Imperial Navy described battleship service as the pinnacle of what the fleet could offer an enlisted man. And in purely engineering terms, the claim was accurate. Yamato and Musashi were genuine achievements. warships that represented the outer edge of what steel and steam and human precision could produce in 1941. But the men who lived inside those achievements experienced something that the technical specifications did not capture. They experienced the boredom of being the fleet's irreplaceable reserve, while the fleet's expendable units were consumed around them. They experienced the discipline of an institution that had no language for what the sustained high-alert state did to a human nervous system. They experienced the specific quality of knowledge that came from being aboard the most powerful warship ever built, when the war demonstrated, definitively and repeatedly, that air power had made the era of the battleship obsolete before the ships themselves were finished. They were the crew of Hotel Yamato. And then, at the end, they were the crew of the ship that was given one-way fuel and sent toward a shore it was never going to reach. The sea off Kyushu does not look different from any other water. Nothing marks the place. The men who went down there went down with everything the institution had trained them to know, and everything it had never given them language to say.